Well, I was tempted to suggest that we give all of my time to Barry because the remarks that Barry made are so very important to setting up any discussion of the anti-war movement in Canada. And there's a lot more to it than the time permitted Barry to really develop. What is so striking to me, hearing Barry's comments, and then trying over the last couple of weeks to think about what might be some of the most important things I could say tonight, is that the commonality between the political issues, the strategical issues and so on that occurred between the U.S. anti-war movement and the Canadian anti-war movement. And that tells me that, and reminds me that these political differences and political problems and challenges, they weren't artificial, or they weren't things that were contrived by the left groups, or that the left groups couldn't get along with each other, and so all of these fights and differences came up. They were issues and differences over fundamental problems of how to respond to the war and the escalation of the war. And so many of the issues that Barry went over also occurred in the anti-war movement in Canada. But there was one significant difference between our experience and the experience in the United States. And so I think probably the best use of my time would be to talk about that and not run the risk of repeating a lot of what Barry was able to go over. The difference is, of course, that Canada was not at war. Canada did not have armed forces in Vietnam. As a matter of fact, the Canadian government attempted to play a qualitatively different role in relation to that war. That is the role of what you might call a soft cop, a pretended neutrality. Canada was a member of the International Control Commission that was set up to enforce the accords that were reached in 1954. And essentially the role of Canada was to be a lawyer for the United States and the other imperialist powers. And this came to be called, in the Canadian anti-war movement, the issue of Canadian complicity. But the movement got underway in Canada roughly at the same time as the United States, a little bit later in terms of significant actions in the 1965-66 period. The political climate that we were up against was very similar. That is, there had been the long deep freeze of McCarthyism, a slow radicalization into the 60s on social questions and so on. But the overwhelming majority of the people saw the war, the guilty party in the war, as being the communists. To give you an example of this, at an NDP rally in 1965, David Lewis, the deputy leader of the NDP, made a speech in which he actually said that, right? That both sides in the war are wrong, that the real culprit behind the war was China, which was trying to expand. This was the line of the David Lewis speech. And that the role of Canada should be to try to get these warring parties to sit down at a negotiating table and solve the problem that way. And that was kind of the broad mood in the country. And as a part of our work of developing the anti-war movement, and when I say our work, I'm referring to the leadership of the forces assembled in the League for Socialist Action and the Young Socialists, who set out working in collaboration with the Comrades of the Socialist Workers' Party to try to build a mass anti-war movement in this country. And it was our biggest task, apart from the general task that Barry talked about, was to educate people around the issue of the role of the Canadian government. And this required a process of going to teach-ins of bringing this issue into the anti-war movement and so on. In the Canadian anti-war movement, we had a similar situation to the United States in the sense that the forces that you would have expected to lead it didn't. And here I'm referring to the organizations like the Student Union for Peace Action, the Canadian Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament, various pacifist groups, and so on. And so we ended up in a similar situation to the United States, where the main tendencies or political currents that were involved in the anti-war movement ranged from forces from the NDP, or the Social Democratic Movement at that time, the Communist Party, and the Revolutionary Marxists or Trotskyists in the League for Socialist Action and the Young Socialists. All of the same debates occurred in Canada because of this. The Communist Party, for example, brought into the movement the outlook of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union and the Soviet government, and to some extent the Chinese government, that is to justify the accords coming out of the Geneva Agreements, to introduce this idea that the problem could be solved in a negotiated way, and therefore the Communist Party would argue that the demands of the movement should be negotiations. And of course we oppose that for the reasons that Barry explained. The NDP initially came into it, the forces of the NDP initially with the attitude of David Lewis. But on the part of the NDP and their forces, there was a significant change over a 5-year period, where we had, for example, by 1971, we had the national leader of the NDP, T.C. Douglas, speaking to a rally that was actually illegal, that had been banned, and calling for immediate withdrawal of the forces. So within a space of 5 years, the New Democratic Party had shifted. And then, as I say, in terms of these currents, there were the Trotskyists who basically, as Barry explained in the attitude of the SWP in the United States, that the character of the struggle in Vietnam was a struggle for national liberation and self-determination, that the U.S. aggression and war, that the U.S. had no right to be there, and that it was along this line and this issue that the anti-war movement had to be developed. And over the space of those years, this issue was also won. We had in the movement similar problems in terms of orientation as to that which Barry described. That is, where should the forces, the initial forces of the anti-war movement go, and who should they try to get involved in the movement? In the beginning, of course, you went to people who were already talking about the war, the political groups and so on. But where should all of these forces look for to expand their support, to develop a base? And here it became a course of moving deeper into the student movement and also into the ranks of the NDP in English Canada, and in Quebec into the nationalist movement, the forces that eventually ended up in their great majority in the Parti Québécois and in the struggle for sovereignty in Quebec. But this was debated out. This didn't just occur, right? This didn't just happen because everybody said, oh, that's obvious. There were big debates over this. There were big debates over the question of whether we should be for out now or negotiations. And another big debate with the people on the extreme left of the movement, the Maoist organizations, and what you would call today ultra-left forces in the student movement, who thought that the movement should be built around the issue of support for the NLF. And one of the favorite slogans of this current, well, you know, Ho Ho Chi Minh and so on, or support to the ultra-left. This provoked a split in the Vancouver Vietnam Action Committee in 1969, where there was really a test of two lines. The Vietnam Action Committee at one point was a coalition that involved all of these forces. There were the NDP was present, the Communist Party forces, there were pacifist forces, and also, of course, the forces of the League for Socialist Action and the Young Socialists. In the course of the building of an action for April of 1969, we had to have a conference in which there were delegates from all the different committees, the student committees, committees in the NDP, different rank and file committees, and we had a conference, and it was very stunning. The conference split down the middle. I think Ken was there, right, Ken? The conference split down the middle. If I recall, there were about 100 people there, and there were 50 people who were for building a demonstration around the line of Out Now and Canadian complicity, and with a mass orientation, that is to try to take this movement deeper into the NDP, into the labor movement, and so on. And then the other half in favor of a demonstration being organized around support for the NLF. Of course, they weren't against being out now, right? That wasn't the issue, but they thought the primary thing should be for the NLF, the National Liberation Front of Vietnam. And in the test of the struggle after the split, two different demonstrations were organized, one for the Saturday and one for the Sunday of that weekend. The demonstration for the NLF drew 400 people. The demonstration around Out Now and Canadian complicity drew 4,000 people. The other difference between the two demonstrations, aside from the factor of 10 in their difference of size, was the social composition. The social composition of the pro-NLF demonstration was largely students, very young. The social composition of the Sunday demonstration on the 25th was much broader in terms of the presence of workers or presence of people from the surrounding communities of Vancouver, but also in its age range. That is, it was just simply a reflection of the two different lines that were at work there. On the Canadian complicity issue, we also had a very interesting experience. This was not simply a debate among the far left or a discussion that involved just people in the anti-war movement. It was a debate that, for example, the NDP had to come to grips with. Should the NDP and its parliamentary caucus pay attention to this issue? Should they move out on it? Should they challenge the government on it? And so on. The government acknowledged that it was an issue and acknowledged that the anti-war movement was a force that had to be dealt with. And from that point forward, Trudeau was on the defensive on this issue. There were more and more journalists and people, researchers and so on, getting out material around the issue. And of course, this was vital because we didn't have a lot to work with. The Canadian complicity was not in the sense that, the government was making statements saying the U.S. is doing a great job. The Canadian government statements were quite different in character, and they were designed to buttress the myth of the neutrality of Canada. But the complicity ranged all the way from heavy arms production and selling of arms to support the U.S. war effort, all the way through to the particular role of the Canadian government in the International Control Commission. And so on that issue, it wasn't something that you could say, look back on it in history and say, well, we won it and the complicity stopped. That's not how it happened. The complicity didn't stop. But the longer the government maintained the complicity, the greater and greater the political price that they paid. Likewise, the longer that this situation prevailed, the more and more sectors of the Canadian population became educated as to the nature of their own government. That is, that this government was a junior partner in many ways and involved in support for the imperialist war, that the myth of Canada as a peacemaker began to break down. I don't know how many of you are familiar with a book by James M. Menifee called Canada Peacemaker or Powder Monkey. That came out at an early phase right? I think in the early 60s or late 50s. But very few people responded to this book or were aware of it. But over time, this book began to circulate in a new and vigorous way, and there were other kinds of books and so on written about this. I wanted to make some other remarks about the relationship between the Canadian anti-war movement and the U.S. anti-war movement. And this has broader implications. One of the reasons why having an orientation to mass actions in the United States and to the soldiers that Barry described is that when these things were seen internationally, when they were seen in England, in Canada, in France, and above all in Vietnam, they inspired people, right? They were visible. They were, you know, if a movement had held itself into small meetings or violent actions or whatever, it would not have had, not just in the United States, its impact, but internationally. But the U.S. anti-war movement had a big impact in helping to interest people and motivate people to be involved because it was showing how things could be done. I can't prove this, but I believe the U.S. anti-war movement had an impact in the May June events in France. That is, the French radical youth saw that they were part not just of a struggle in Vietnam against imperialism, but they saw an anti-imperialist force developing in the United States itself. And the issue of whether this force was anti-imperialist or not was not settled by what slogans they used. It was settled by what they did to mobilize against the war. That's what gave it its character. And this was visible internationally. And it was certainly very important in terms of the inspiration of the Vietnamese fighters themselves. And so when we come to this talk, or these couple of talks, and the theme is the history and the lessons, and of course it's not really so much a history because we don't have time, so we'll concentrate on the lessons. But one of the lessons that we have is that the war, the U.S. war against Vietnam was not defeated alone by the Vietnamese or alone by the anti-war movement in the United States. It was defeated by a combination of those two forces, above all by the Vietnamese, but importantly as well by the movement in the United States. And then the international extensions of this movement. This is an important lesson for us to think about in terms of current struggles. One last comment. Many of the tactical and strategical lessons of the struggle, we need to think about them in terms of today's struggles, but we shouldn't go back into that history, in my opinion, and try to, use them as a template and say, in all of the situations that we face, to say, well, they did it that way then, that's where we'll do it that way now. I don't think that's how lessons of history are genuinely and successfully applied. But when you look underneath some of the tactical decisions and so on and see how they stemmed from and were related to major political differences of assessment about the character of the war and of assessment about the role of different governments and so on, there is where you will find a way to relate some of these lessons to current struggles, such as the current anti-war movement. So I'll leave it at that. I think we're out of time, right?
Two books that I'll mention. One I don't have with me. This one I do. Out Now is a book you can get from the public library, or you can order through the various bookstores.